An aging Iranian F-14 Tomcat lights its afterburners off a coastal strip near Bandar Abbas. The jet hauls into a climbing left turn, variable geometry wings sweeping back as it claws for altitude over the Persian Gulf. Inside the cockpit, the weapons officer's thumb hovers over the release. The target, a slow-orbiting US E-2D Hawkeye 3 miles below, 20 miles offshore, the electronic eye that feeds every air picture in the theater. The weapons officer squeezes. An AIM-54 Phoenix drops off the pylon, its ancient motor ignites, and the missile climbs. Range to target. Inside engagement parameters. The Tomcat crew has one thought. The radar plane never sees it coming. They are wrong. 3 minutes from now, that F-14 will be cartwheeling into the Persian Gulf. The Tomcat pilot had one window, salvo and run, or commit and close. Both roads led to the same water. This is how it ended. To understand what happens next, you have to understand what the E-2D Hawkeye actually is, because IRG planners almost certainly underestimated it. The Hawkeye is not a fast mover. It is not heavily armed. It is a twin-turbo prop aircraft the size of a regional airliner, and from a distance it looks soft, slow, and utterly vulnerable. That appearance is the entire trap. The advanced Hawkeye E-2D variant carries the AN/CAPI-9 radar system, an ultra-high-frequency array capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges out to nearly 550 kilometers. It does not just detect threats, it fuses them. Every fighter, every surface ship, every submarine-launched asset in the region feeds into the air picture that the E-2D builds and broadcasts in real time. The Hawkeye is not an aircraft, it is a flying command node, and without it, the carrier strike group flies partially blind. That is why the F-14 crew was sent after it. Take down the Hawkeye, and you degrade the entire coalition air picture over the Strait of Hormuz. You punch a hole in the surveillance architecture before you do anything else. It is a logical play, on paper. The problem is that the E-2D was specifically engineered to survive exactly this kind of attack. What most people miss about the AN/CAPI-9 is how different it is from older airborne early warning radars. Previous Hawkeye generations used mechanically scanned antennas, physical dishes that rotated to sweep the sky. The APY-9 uses an electronically scanned array, which means it can simultaneously search, track, and illuminate multiple targets across completely different sectors without physically moving anything. The radar beam steers electronically, in fractions of a millisecond, in any direction within its field of regard. It can watch a fast-moving fighter at high altitude while simultaneously tracking a sea-skimming anti-ship missile 50 kilometers away and correlating a surface contact on the strait, all at once, all feeding into the same fused picture. The capability gap between what the APY-9 can see and what the IRGC's ground radar network can see, particularly in the complex low-altitude clutter environment over the Persian Gulf's shallow coastal waters, is not marginal. It is generational. Let's set the board. The Persian Gulf, late afternoon, the sun is low and orange over the Iranian coast. Near Bandar Abbas, a city that sits directly on the Strait of Hormuz and hosts the IRGC Navy's most active surface and air assets, the Tomcat has been sitting on alert. It is one of a dwindling number of F-14s that the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force still keeps airworthy. Iran received 79 F-14 Tomcats from the United States before the 1979 revolution, and decades of sanctions, cannibalizations, and crashes have ground that fleet down to a handful of marginally flyable frames. Each surviving Tomcat is irreplaceable. The AIM-54 Phoenix strapped to this aircraft is in the same condition. The Phoenix was the longest-range air-to-air missile in the world when it entered U.S. service, a 100-mile range, 600-pound weapon designed to destroy Soviet bombers at standoff distance. Iran has been trying to maintain its Phoenix stockpile since the arms pipeline from America closed in 1979. Every missile they fire is one they cannot replace. The decision to launch one at an E-2D is not tactical improvisation. Someone in the IRGC command chain decided this was worth the cost. The Tomcat in question had been through 3 maintenance cycles in the past 18 months. Iranian technicians, some of the most resourceful aircraft mechanics in the world, working under impossible constraints, had sourced hydraulic seals from a cannibalized frame at a base in Isfahan, rewired portions of the AWG-9 radar's signal processing unit using components reverse-engineered from a different avionics system entirely, and replaced a cracked engine inlet guide vane with a hand-fabricated part that passed inspection, but that no U.S.-trained engineer would have signed off on. The aircraft flew. It flew well enough. But it was flying on borrowed time and borrowed parts, and everyone in the maintenance chain knew it. The crew was not improvised. The pilot had logged over 2,000 hours in the Tomcat and had trained extensively on the Phoenix employment. Envelope, understanding its older generation proportional navigation guidance, its radar seeker acquisition cone, the specific altitude and speed conditions under which it performed best. The weapons officer had studied E-2D employment patterns from IRGC intelligence reports and had a rough model of the Hawkeye's typical orbit geometry. They were not amateurs. They were professionals working with a 40-year-old toolbox against a system designed in the 21st century. 20 miles offshore, the E-2D Hawkeye orbits in a lazy holding pattern at medium altitude. Its ANAP-9 radar is sweeping continuously. Inside the cabin, the three-man crew, a combat information center officer, an air control officer, and a radar operator, monitors the air picture. They have been watching the F-14 since it rolled out of its hardened shelter near the coast. The radar operator noted the Tomcat's taxi and takeoff sequence 22 minutes before the launch. He logged the contact, assigned it a track number, and called it out to the air control officer. The air control officer cross-referenced against the known alert posture data for Bandar Abbas. The IRGC typically kept 1 or 2 Tomcats on. 15-minute alert at the main base, and flagged it to the Combat Information Center officer as a potential offensive launch profile. That assessment went out over the data link to the destroyer below and to the 2 F-35Cs already on combat air patrol to the northeast. By the time the F-14 climbed through 10,000 feet and its radar went active, 3 separate crews in 3 separate platforms were already watching it and had already begun running contingency planning. Here is what the IRGC crew did not account for. The E-2D was watching the launch, not after the Phoenix ignited, before. The ANAP-9 radar detected the F-14's fire control radar locking up. It detected the pre-launch emissions. The crew had the track, the bearing, the velocity vector, all of it, before the Phoenix motor even burned through its first second of propellant. The timer started not when the missile left the rail. It started when the Tomcat's radar went active. What's most surprising about this engagement isn't the outcome, it's the margin. The E-2D crew had already begun their response sequence before the missile was even tracking. And there was a second layer. 2 F-35C Lightning IIs were already riding combat air patrol at high altitude, 30 miles northeast. They had the same air picture. They had been watching the same Tomcat. When the Phoenix launch registered on the E-2D's systems, both F-35 crews already had a solution. The Tomcat pilot had just handed the initiative to 3 different systems simultaneously, and none of them needed time to react. The E-2D crew executes the first defensive move. The Hawkeye drops to low altitude, descending sharply toward the Gulf surface, trading the high-altitude orbit for the radar clutter of the sea. At low level, the Phoenix's radar seeker has to fight through ground return, or in this case, water return. The geometry changes, the lock degrades. This is not evasion through speed. The Hawkeye cannot outrun an AIM-54. This is evasion through geometry, and the crew knows exactly how to use it. The descent is not a panic dive. It is a precisely calculated maneuver, the kind that gets drilled in the Hawkeye community's weapons and tactics training until it becomes muscle memory. The pilot banks into a coordinated descending turn, bleed rate calibrated to maximize the angular change in the Phoenix's intercept geometry while keeping the aircraft's radar operational. The 3 mission crew members in the back do not stop working during the descent. The air control officer continues broadcasting the full tactical picture. The radar operator keeps the APY-9 sweeping. The Combat Information Center officer is already talking to the destroyer, passing the Phoenix track data with the precision needed for a surface intercept solution. The aircraft is evading and operating simultaneously because the crew trained for exactly this contingency and because the mission doesn't stop just because someone is trying to kill you. Simultaneously, the E-2D broadcasts the full Phoenix track data, launch point velocity, intercept geometry to every asset in the network. The Arleigh Burke class destroyer riding surface watch far below receives the data package. Its S-1D radar was already tracking the missile. The fire control solution is already computed. The order goes out. An SM-6 launches from the destroyer's forward vertical launch system. The Standard Missile-6 is not a defensive missile in the way people typically imagine. It is not a last-ditch, short-range interceptor. The SM-6 is an active radar homing weapon with a range exceeding 240 nautical miles and a terminal velocity approaching Mach 3.5. It can engage targets at altitude at low level and in the terminal phase of an anti-ship attack. Against an AIM-54 Phoenix traveling inbound at high supersonic speed, the SM-6 has a kinematic advantage that the old Phoenix missile, aging motor, aging seeker, cannot overcome. The SM-6 climbs out of the destroyer's forward launcher and turns toward the Phoenix track. Put yourself in the Tomcat pilot seat for a moment. You have just fired your best shot at the softest target in the air picture. The Phoenix is tracking. The Hawkeye has descended, but you still have acquisition. And then the radar warning receiver in your cockpit starts screaming, not from ahead, from below. From a surface ship you knew was out there but counted on being too far to respond in time. It was not too far. The SM-6 reaches the Phoenix. The intercept is clean. The decades-old AIM-54, the last of its kind, irreplaceable, the product of years of Iranian maintenance work trying to keep Cold War technology alive, comes apart over the Persian Gulf without ever reaching. The Hawkeye, the missile, is gone. But the engagement is not over, because the lead F-35C, riding high above the entire sequence, has been computing a firing solution on the F-14 since the Phoenix left the rail, and the Tomcat, having fired its primary weapon, having committed its position, having drawn the exact response it hoped to avoid, is now out of energy, out of options, and in a very bad place. Here is the tactical reality that sealed the F-14's fate. The variable geometry wing Tomcat is a big, powerful aircraft, genuinely dangerous in its day, with a radar and missile combination that was ahead of almost anything it would have faced in the 1970s and 1980s. But that day is 40 years in the past. The F-14's radar, the WG-9, was never upgraded in Iranian service. The aircraft's airframe has been maintained under sanctions with cannibalized parts and improvised solutions. Its engines, the TF-30 turbofans that powered early Tomcats, are notoriously finicky even under good conditions, and Iran has been nursing these engines for decades. More critically, the F-14 had just committed. It had climbed to launch altitude, gone active on radar, fired, and was now in a climbing turn trying to extend away from the coast. That maneuver, energy expensive, predictable in geometry, executed by an aircraft already running warm engines at altitude, is visible to the F-35 the way a flare is visible in the dark. The F-35C does not use afterburner. It does not need to close rapidly. The ANAP EG-81 ASA radar has been tracking the Tomcat through the entire sequence. The pilot already has missile tone. He has had missile tone for the better part of the last 90 seconds. The Iran F-14 crew probably had a brief window of awareness. The radar warning receiver would have painted the F-35's radar, though AAS's emissions are harder to characterize than legacy radar systems, and the Tomcat's RWR was not designed to read them precisely. They may have known in the last seconds that they had been tracked the entire time, that the ambush they planned had inverted, that they were the ones who had been watched. The weapons officer may have attempted a last-ditch countermeasure deployment, chaff bundles, a hard brake turn, the mechanical responses that a trained crew falls back on when the tactical situation has collapsed and instinct takes over from deliberate thought. The Tomcat's countermeasures dispenser, if it was loaded and functional, would have fired a cloud of radar-reflective foil strips into the slipstream. Against an Omram's active radar seeker, the chaff geometry at that closure rate was not favorable. Against an adversary pilot who had been tracking for 90 seconds and already had tone, it was too late. The brake turn cost the F-14 the energy margin it needed. The aircraft's nose came down into the turn, speed bled off, and the window for any meaningful evasion closed. The F-35 pilot fires the AIM-120D AMRAAM, an active radar homing, beyond visual range missile with roughly double the range of the Phoenix it replaced, covers the intercept geometry in seconds. The F-14, descending now on a hard brake, engines at full military power, runs out of sky. The Tomcat cartwheels into the Persian Gulf. One of Iran's last flyable F-14s, one irreplaceable AIM-54 Phoenix, one IRG aircrew. Gone in the same 3-minute window the Tomcat pilot thought was his operational advantage. Let's be honest about what this cost. The E-2D Hawkeye survived, the SM-6 intercepted the Phoenix cleanly. The F-35 prosecuted the Tomcat kill. From a purely operational standpoint, the engagement was textbook. Every system performed its function, every crew executed its role, and the attacker was neutralized without a single American casualty. But there is a detail here that doesn't sit right, even now. The IRGC did not send this aircraft on a suicide mission by accident. Someone in Tehran's military command structure looked at the force balance. One aging Tomcat, one aging Phoenix, against a carrier strike group with SM-6 interceptors, a CESA-equipped 5th-generation fighters, and a networked surveillance aircraft, and decided to commit anyway. That is either desperation or a calculated acceptance of loss. Neither of those describes a force that sees a path to victory. The IRGC Air Arm in 2026 is not the Iranian Air Force of 1980, when US-supplied Tomcats were among the most capable aircraft in the region. It is a service running on legacy hardware, cannibalized maintenance, and a doctrine built around threats that matured before the F-35 existed. What strikes me about this engagement is not the technology gap that was visible to anyone who ran the numbers. It is the decision to launch at all, knowing what the response architecture looked like. That decision tells you something about the institutional culture on the other side of the strait. The belief that a symbolic gesture, even a losing one, carries deterrent value. That being seen as willing to shoot is worth more than the aircraft and crew you spend doing it. The problem, as the Gulf demonstrated, is that the other side does not read that message as deterrence. They read it as a targeting solution. There is something worth sitting with in the human dimension of this engagement. The pilot and weapons officer who flew the Tomcat were not ideologues on a martyrdom mission. By every available account of how the IRG Air Arm actually functions, they were career aviators, men who had spent years, possibly decades, inside the small and shrinking world of Iranian fast jet aviation. They knew the F-14 the way you know a tool you have used your entire professional life. They understood its margins, its quirks, the particular feel of its controls at high altitude and high speed. They had trained on the Phoenix employment profiles until the numbers were automatic. They were professionals executing a mission that someone above them had decided was necessary. in an aircraft that the entire chain of command knew was irreplaceable, carrying a weapon that the entire chain of command knew could not be reordered from any catalog anywhere in the world. After the Gulf went quiet, Iranian state media reported nothing. No acknowledgement, no statement of loss, no official comment on the engagement. The families of the crew would have been informed through military channels, the same opaque institutional process that handles all such notifications in a system that does not publicly account for its losses. Two families learned, in whatever way the IRGC delivers that kind of news, that their husbands and fathers and sons had not returned from a mission over the strait. The aircraft that carried them out of Bandar Abbas that afternoon is somewhere on the floor of the Persian Gulf, joining whatever other debris the decades of intermittent conflict in that body of water have deposited there. That accounting, the human one, not the hardware one, is the part of these engagements that the force balance charts don't capture. The SM-6 that destroyed the Phoenix will be replaced. The AMRAAM that killed the Tomcat will be replaced. The aircrew will not be replaced. In a service as small and as constrained as the IRGC's manned aviation arm, losing 2 experienced aviators is a wound that compounds over time. The cost accounting is brutal in its simplicity. Iran expended one of its last airworthy F-14 Tomcats, a platform it cannot replace under any current sanctions regime, and one AIM-54 Phoenix from a stockpile that has been shrinking since 1979. The crew did not return. The Hawkeye they targeted continued its orbit after a brief descent, rejoined the air picture, and was back on station within 20 minutes. The U.S. expended one SM-6, a missile that costs approximately $4 million but can be replenished from a manufacturing line that does not exist in Iran. 2 F-35Cs burned fuel and one AIM-120D. The carrier strike group's combat power was not meaningfully degraded. The air picture was never lost. The exchange ratio, 1 F-14 and 1 Phoenix against 1 SM-6 and 1 AMRAAM, is not a ratio Iran can sustain. Here is the take that will probably draw some comments. The F-14's launch was not a military mistake. It was a political one. Militarily, the Tomcat crew knew the odds were bad. They flew the mission anyway because someone above them needed to demonstrate resolve at a moment when Tehran's strategic position in the Gulf was deteriorating. The pilot and weapons officer paid for that decision with their lives. The generals who gave the order did not. That asymmetry between those who make the decision and those who execute it is not unique to Iran, but it is especially visible when the decision produces wreckage on the floor of the Persian Gulf. After the engagement, Tehran did not send another F-14 near the Hawkeye's orbit. The lesson was not only about Phoenix missiles and SM-6 interceptors. It was about information. The E-2D had the full picture before the first shot was fired. Every asset in the strike group knew where the Tomcat was, what it was doing, and what it was about to do before the Tomcat crew finished arming their weapon. That is the core of how the U.S. Navy fights in the Strait of Hormuz today. Not platform against platform, a one-on-one duel where individual capability decides the outcome. Network against platform. The F-35 is not 3 times better than an F-14 in a turning fight. It is connected to a system that makes the turning fight irrelevant. By the time the adversary is in a position to engage, every option except one has already been closed. The architecture that enabled that outcome is worth understanding in some detail because it is the part of modern carrier aviation that never gets the attention the aircraft themselves receive. The Link 16 tactical data link, the communications backbone that stitched the E-2D, the destroyer, and the 2 F-35Cs into a single operational system during this engagement, transmits position, velocity, identification, and weapon state data for every track contact to every node on the network simultaneously, continuously, at update rates fast enough that no meaningful gap opens between what one platform knows and what every other platform knows. When the E-2D detected the F-14's radar going active, that information was on the destroyer's combat system display and in the F-35 cockpits within seconds. Not relayed by radio, with all the latency and potential for misunderstanding that voice communication introduces. Transmitted digitally, precisely with the same quality of data that the originating sensor had. That is what the IRGC was actually up against. Not an E-2D, not 2 F-35Cs, not an Arleigh Burke. All of them simultaneously sharing a single picture, making decisions from a single common operating environment that the Tomcat crew could not see, could not access, and could not degrade. The Hawkeye is the reason that network functions. It is the most important aircraft in the air picture, and arguably the most important aircraft in the carrier air wing, not because of what it can do to the enemy, but because of what it tells every other platform that can. Targeting it is logical. Executing that targeting is something else entirely. The question the IRGC now has to answer is not tactical. It is existential for their air arm. If the Tomcat is the only platform they have with the range and the missile to threaten the Hawkeye at standoff, and the Hawkeye sees the Tomcat before the Tomcat can execute, what is the actual military value of the remaining F-14 fleet? Not the symbolic value. not the deterrent signal value, the kinetic value measured in things you can actually hit before you lose the aircraft? That question does not have a good answer. And deep in IRC air planning cells, someone knows it. The harder version of that question reaches beyond the F-14 fleet entirely. It asks whether any manned strike platform the IRGC currently operates, the aging fleet of F-4 Phantoms, the Su-24 Fencers acquired before the Soviet collapse, the domestically produced Kausar light fighters that Tehran periodically showcases for domestic audiences, has a realistic offensive employment profile against a networked carrier strike group operating with E-2D surveillance overhead, and SM-6 coverage from multiple surface combatants. The honest assessment, one that some within the IRGC's own analytical structure have reportedly reached, is that for manned aviation the answer is largely no. The IRGC's pivot toward ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drone swarms is not incidental. It is the institutional conclusion of a force that has looked at the manned aviation balance, run the numbers against modern integrated air defense and networked strike, and decided that the future does not look like the F-14 engagement over the Strait. It looks like mass, saturation, and systems that don't require a trained crew to die at the front end of every strike. The Tomcat pilot had one window. He took it. 3 minutes later, the aircraft that was supposed to be the hunter was debris on the floor of the Gulf, and the radar plane it tried to blind had already resumed its orbit, feeding the air picture to the same strike group the IRGC wanted to threaten. What would you have done in that cockpit? Salvo and run, or commit and close? Drop your version in the comments. We are genuinely curious to see the calls people make before we walk through how it played out in the debrief. Tehran has not sent another Tomcat near the Hawkeye orbit. When an aging airframe and a Cold War missile meet an AESA radar, a network destroyer, and a fifth-generation fighter working as a single system, the result is not a battle. It is a calculation. And the calculation ran out on the F-14 before it finished its first turn. If you want to see how the other pieces of that network operate, how the Arleigh Burke class actually fights in the modern Gulf, and what happens when the IRGC decides to test the surface picture instead of the air picture, that one is already up. The button is right there.